With Alan Sr., February 20th, 2003. Served in World War II, sergeant in the U.S. Army Air Corps, and he was a waist gunner on a B24.
Could you describe when you heard about Pearl Harbor and what effect did it have on you and your family?
I remember very distinctly what I was doing on December 7th, 1941. I was riding in a girlfriend's car. I was sitting in the middle next to her, and there was another girl on the other side, and we were just driving around visiting some friends, and the announcement came over the radio about the attack. And the reaction, as you can imagine, to some juniors in high school was wondering what's going to happen to us as we were of the military age coming up. So it wasn't any great feeling of despair, shock, and worry. We just knew we were going to be at war and we were going to win it. It never occurred that anything else could be the outcome.
Were you drafted or did you enlist?
I came close to being drafted, but I did enlist in the voluntary induction program. I wanted to be a flyer, and the only way you could assume that you were going to be in the Air Force was to join the Air Cadets. And so I proceeded to take the exams and did that all, and I even had my service record with me, except the one part that wasn't accepted and completed was the weight and the physical. Being a skinny kid of 17 at the time, I only weighed 121 pounds, and I had to weigh 128 to get in. So here I was with the countdown to my 18th birthday coming in May, and I couldn't gain any weight. So we worked around that. A friend of mine told me about drinking a gallon of water because of the pint a pound the world around, and so we got in my dad's car and drove to the post office in Buffalo, New York, and parked outside on the street early morning, and I proceeded to drink as much as that gallon of water as I could, except for just maybe an inch or two in the bottom. I just couldn't hold anymore and told my friend, let's go. So he steered me across the street up to the 4th floor of the Federal Building, and when I got up there, I'd been up there several times before trying to get weighed to pass. There was a line stretching down the hall and around the corner, and I said to my friend that I'll never make it if I have to stay in the bottom of that line. So I went up to the sergeant, who knew me by sight by that time, and he said, "Senior, what are you doing here?" And I said, "Sir, I want to get weighed." He said, "Okay." So he stopped the line, I stepped on the scales, and he asked me how much I was supposed to weigh, and I said, 128. He said, "You just made it, now get the heck out of here." So you can imagine how happy I was at the time, and I have to say we never passed a gas station on the 14-mile ride home.
Why did you pick the service branch that you joined?
Oh, I always wanted to fly, wanted to be a pilot, and I just couldn't imagine being in the Navy or the Army. I just had to do that. I would not have, I can't imagine what life would have been if I hadn't been in the Air Force.
Do you recall your first days in the service, and what did it feel like?
Well, there were two of us from that were in the Air Force, going in the Air Force, and I was living in a small town of under 6,000 people outside of Buffalo, New York. And so my two friends would board a train at night going to Greensboro, North Carolina, where we had basic. That was the last I saw my two friends. They went their way and I went mine. They both became, I think, navigators. And I didn't quite make it through the Air Cadet program. I became your aerial gunner. So basic training was in June in North Carolina wasn't any great hardship. It was quite a change of life for me. I was the only child, and there's not too many accommodations you have to make. The biggest one I had to make in the service was eating the Army food, because it wasn't all good, in my opinion.
After boot camp and gunnery training, where exactly were you stationed and what unit were you attached to?
Well, the basic training, and then I went to a couple training schools, and then after that I made it to Laredo, Texas for gunnery. Excuse me. And like the Army does things, I attended the winter in Vermont and the gunnery school in Texas, June, July, and August. And it was hot. In fact, I have a clipping that was taken out of the base paper that said the mercury skids to refreshing 113. And talk about gaining weight, I lost what little weight I had then, and when I left I weighed 115. It got so hot we couldn't fly the airplanes because they couldn't be serviced. And physical training was canceled, which the Army never does, but it just was miserable. That's where I learned how to drink iced tea. We were out on the gunnery range, and they had a big wash tub there, and they'd throw a 100-pound cake of ice in there and throw the tea in there, and then you, at break time, you took your canteen cup and elbowed your way up to the wash tub and to get yourself a cold drink.
What unit were you ultimately attached to?
At that time we were still in the training mode, so it wasn't in a unit so much. From there we went to Lincoln, Nebraska, where we became assigned to a crew. There was pilot, co-pilot, and all the other elements and jobs assigned. And the way it turned out, I'd been trained as a nose gunner. Come to find out they had two nose gunners, so they didn't have any turret gunners, ball turret gunners. So my enthusiasm, I said, well, I'll do that. But I didn't realize that was going to mean considerable more hours training to use the ball turret. And it's not claustrophobic for me. It was just the idea of being isolated that bothered me a little bit. But all my work and worry was mitigated when we went to England, because the 2nd Air Division had chosen to take out the ball turrets. So I became a waist gunner, which was much better. I knew what was going on as a waist gunner because I could see more than the pilot or anyone else. Although statistically the waist gunners suffered the highest casualty rate of any position on the airplane, which I didn't learn until later. It wouldn't have made much difference because you're there, you're going to either make it or break it.
Do you remember arriving at your base in England, and where was this base located?
Well, first let me say that we flew overseas. We picked up a brand new B24 and we picked it up at Topeka, Kansas, and flew it to Grenier Field, New Hampshire. And then on our way overseas, we flew to Goose Bay, Labrador, Bluey West, Newfoundland, and then from there to Iceland, And because of the weather, we spent 2 glorious weeks in Iceland, and then flew on to Wales. And from Wales, we left our airplane, were picked up by transport, and taken to another supply base for a few days, and we were assigned to the 446 Bomb Group in Bungay, Norwich, which is East Anglia, sort of northeast from London.
Could you describe your living conditions at your base?
It was the usual barracks with the cots, and what was different from the barracks in the States, they had 3 little charcoal stoves, and the mattresses, instead of being all one piece, they were 3 different separate pieces, and we called them biscuits, and they were always separating while you slept, and you sagged down in between the biscuits. But it was fine. It wasn't a hardship at all, and I didn't feel that it was bad.
How many missions did you fly, and over what period of time?
We arrived in England in January, and we started flying, I suppose, in March. We only flew 10 missions, and the war ended. I flew the last mission at the 8th Air Force, flew on April 25, 1945, to Salzburg, Germany. It was my second trip, or our second trip to Salzburg, which is in southern Germany, bordering the Alps there. And so we flew the 10 missions from, say, March to, well, let me see, maybe it was February to April 25th. We were flying quite regularly, so we would have had our 30 missions in pretty soon if the war had not ended.
Do you remember, or could you list specific or typical mission targets or objectives?
Well, as the war was winding down, the Air Force was asked to concentrate on transportation, which would be the trains, the gasoline, synthetic gasoline, and airfields, which really, the way it turned out afterwards, if the United States or the Allies had concentrated on those targets, the war might have ended earlier, because the railroads were rebuilt over the next few days and were in operation at night, but the bridges, the airfields, and particularly the oil and the ersatz gasoline was they couldn't move without the oil, and they produced just as many airplanes when the war was ending as they did at the start of the war, some 8,000 units, but they didn't have fuel or pilots enough to fly them. They couldn't practice, they couldn't teach anybody to fly the Me-262, which was a wonderful airplane, 100 miles faster than the P-51, and it was fortunate for us that they didn't, because it would have devastated the bomber train.
Could you describe your duties during a mission? For example, what tasks did you perform? What were the problems encountered? And how do you feel your job contributed to your bomb group success?
I was trained as an armorer, and I was an armor gunner for the group, for the crew. But a lot of the training for armorer was taken over by the gun crew. So my duties didn't involve installation of the guns or anything, or the gun barrels, because the ground crew did that. I did the distributing of the escape packets and the rations that we would use if we had to bail out. Primarily, my biggest job was, the most responsible job was arming the bombs, which was the method of putting in arming wires attached to the bomb racks and taking out the cotter pins. At the end of the tail fuse, they had a propeller. It was held in place by a cotter pin. So my job was to collect all the cotter pins so I could show the pilot afterwards that the bombs are armed when they left the airplane. Then insert the wires. And in one particular mission, the weather was always bad. In this mission it was bad. So I had, as we approached 10,000 feet, we had to go on oxygen at 11. I was told to go ahead and arm the bombs, which I did. And I just got sat down. In about 15 minutes, the pilot said, "The mission is off. Go put the cotter pins back in." And by that time, we're passing towards 11,000 feet. It gets a little bit cold. You can't take the cotter pins out with your gloves on. And you can't have an oxygen mask there. And I was one of those people who, I required my oxygen before 11,000 feet. I felt better with that. So I put the cotter pins back in, took out the arming wires and put the cotter pins back in, then went back to the waist and sat down. And in 10 minutes, I was told the mission's off again, on again, take the cotter pins out, put the arming wires in. So, okay. This time it's close to 11,000 feet, and it's getting colder, because it's still in the wintertime, or springtime. So I did that, collected my cotter pins, and sat down again, and it wasn't 10 minutes more, and I was told, put the cotter pins back in. And by that time, the cotter pins looked like a snake. They were bent, out of shape. I couldn't get them in the holes. It was getting cold. And it's all, you had to be careful because desperation starts to take over, and you couldn't let the crew down. I said, I've got to do this. And the cotter pins kept dropping on the bomb bay, and then I'd have to move over, and I couldn't reach it with one hand, so I have to reach it, base myself with two, and that means propeller starts turning. So just by force of will, I was able to get those bent cotter pins for the third time back in the tail fuse. And what made it difficult, there we were having a sort of cluster bombs. They weren't large bombs. They might have been 250 pounders or not over 500 pounders. And they had the tail fins, and they're sharp, and you had to get your hand down and around. And you know, you just say, well, I got to do this. There's no substitution for failure. You know, you got to do it. And I can't call out the pilot and say, hey, I can't do this. You know, you would never think of doing that. So it was done, and I went back and sat down, and at that moment I would have given a week's, or better yet, a month's pay for a pair of $3 Sears pliers to straighten those things out. So we proceeded to turn around and come back to base. And the worst part about it is we didn't get any mission credit for all that. So we just had another nice long airplane ride.
Could you tell me about a couple of your most memorable experiences of your missions flown over Europe?
Well, the one I just described was the one. There never were any real scary situations. We did lose a engine over a target we came back on 3 engines. I think that was more due to engine malfunction than through enemy action. And we had to pull out and fly alongside of the bomber stream on our way back. It was uneventful. The fighters came over and let us know that they were watching us and taking care of us. Well, then another time we had a bomb rack for some cluster bombs hit our wing and was embedded in the wing right after bombs away. So it caused a little drag, but didn't fortunately hit an engine, so we were all right there. We didn't have to fall out of formation there. So the looking at the other airplanes and seeing the flag that some of them had to go through, it was really, we really were fortunate. The aircraft, I mean the anti-aircraft guns couldn't fire at everybody. So they'd either pick your group or the group behind you, the group ahead of you, and the same was true of fighter interceptions. We'd get an alert, the pilot would say, okay, gunners be on alert, the group ahead of us is experiencing fighter attack. So we'd get all ready, and then there wouldn't be any, they'd hit the group behind us. There were a lot of groups or planes that weren't so fortunate. I remember seeing a battery of 4 anti-aircraft guns tracking a B-17 group, I believe it was, about maybe a half to 3/4 of a mile flying alongside of us, and the last plane in the formation, this burst of 4 would fire, it would be a little closer each time and a little closer each time, and then we turned for our initial point to make our bomb run. So I never did learn to see what happened. It didn't look good because the flak was very heavy. More so, it was more of a danger than fighters were at that time because of the Luftwaffe was beaten, except for the Me-262 attacks. A crew member and a bunk member, not a member of our crew, but another gunner, he did get credit for shooting one down that flew in his formation. I wasn't on that mission, but it was 1 or 2 days before or after mine.
Was there something special you did for good luck?
No, I really don't believe in those things. But I did, we always went to Mass for the chaplain. It didn't make any difference to me whether it was Catholic or Protestant. We went, and you just tried to be alert and do the best you can. I don't think luck has something to do with after the event, but in getting ready for it, luck plays no part of it.
Were you awarded any medals or citations, and if so, how did you get them?
My service time was pretty uneventful. Like many others, we got the Air Medal, and that was the extent of it. We had it very easy compared to the men who went over in 43 and 42. They were writing the book as they went along there. Our group went over in 43 and had one of the best safety records of any group, and that was partly due and greatly due to the tight formations we flew. And as a tribute to that our group was chosen to lead the 8th Air Force on D-Day because of bombing accuracy and known for our on-time performance, which means that we were formed and ready to go at the proper time and reached the rendezvous point at the proper time. And it's a tribute to the crews at that time that we did that.
During downtime, how often did you or were able to stay in touch with your family?
Oh, by letters, that was all. And fortunately, I didn't have any girlfriends, and I wasn't married, and I wasn't even close to being married, so I didn't have any girl problems about not hearing from them or any Dear John letters. I was just a young boy having a great adventure, and I can talk about it, and I'm proud of the service. A lot of it, and of course, is because I was not hurt, didn't suffer. I know some other people did, and they don't want to talk about it, and I understand that. But I am, it was a significant part of my life that I remember, and not particularly, I didn't win the war by any stretch of imagination, but
What did you think of officers or the fellow soldiers that you served with?
well, I'd say the Air Force officers were good. One part about it, they were highly trained and therefore well educated and did their jobs well. Not everybody in the crew was a bosom pal of mine. Seems like we were all from different states, but the pilot and I got along very well, and we had a relationship after the war until he passed on. And one interesting factor about that, his grandson never knew his grandfather. And so he wanted to learn more about what his grandfather did in the war. And he was smart enough to figure out how to do that. He went ahead and, on an internet site, he got an English email address. And this is luck. He went ahead and emailed this individual over there wanting to know, do you know Alan Sr.? He was with Bob Drake's crew, and etc. And he, out of all the people he could have had to see his email, was an English man who I'd met in England, and he and his wife had come over and visited our house here. And he wrote back and said, of course I know Alan Sr. Here's his address, here's his telephone number. And that young man, Michael Anthony, I'm his surrogate grandfather, I guess. I just recently came back from attending his wedding at Jekyll Island, Georgia. And he and the family just treated Joyce and myself like family. And he is a wonderful young man, just wonderful. He's a former Eagle Scout, graduated from Dosta College in Georgia. So I keep, the whole family is, they wanted me to tell them about their father. There's a son and 2 daughters. So at Jekyll Island, I had previously sent them quite a few pictures, but it just made me feel good that I could help them connect.
How would you perceive the American attitudes towards the local civilian population?
Oh, in England it was just wonderful. The local people were somewhat standoffish because they're more conservative than we are, as I recall. But after a while, they liked us. We shared some of our rations with him, some good times with him. Oh, and if I've got time, I'd like to just tell you a story, and it's another coincidence. When I was in, let me see, about the 10th grade, the English teacher said that we need to get pen pals. So I got a pen pal of a girl from England. So we corresponded back and forth, and I told her that with the war, I might come over to England. You know, I might be over there in the Air Force. And the way it came about, I did. I went to meet her. She lived in Todmorden, which is up near Manchester in the industrial section. And her name was Florence Britton, if you can believe that. And we just had a wonderful weekend. I took one of my crew members, the other waist gunner, with me, and I had somehow gotten a box of Whitman's chocolates, some lipsticks, and some stockings, and took them up there, and met Florence and her mother and her father and her sister, and we had a candlelight dinner because of the blackout. And Mrs. Britton, the next morning, we stayed in a pub, Ronald and I, and so they came, after breakfast, she came by and picked us up and walked us down to the market, holding my arm, and she introduced us as, "This is Florence's friend from America, Alan." And it just was a wonderful experience. Who would have ever thought that that would have happened? You know, that's like the lottery odds are now. But that was another nice experience that I had, and I corresponded with them, with her and her family, when I got back to the States, and then we started drifting apart.
In general, with your interaction with other British civilians, how did you perceive their attitude towards you and your crewmate or crewmates?
Oh, there was some rivalry there, and it was partly our fault. We had, you know, the old expression, we were overpaid, oversexed, and over there. It was, that was part of it. A lot of it probably was accidental. I don't think any of us tried to do that. I know my friends didn't. But it was, we'd on our 1 or 2 or 3 day passes that I had in London, you'd go into a pub and there'd always be somebody there wanting to challenge you somewhat. In fact, I got in a taxi, another crew member and myself, and there were 2 Americans in there, and they got after us. They said, "You damn guys bombed us," and they named some city, and I said, well, it's really hard to tell at 20-some thousand feet who's down there. And your leaders, your officers, should have been in touch with the Allies to tell them, don't bomb here. You fellows did a great job. You moved so fast, and when we had our orders, we dropped the bombs there when we're as ordered. So needless to say, we were glad to get out of the taxi. I don't think they really bought my story very well, but that's understandable as well.
In addition to some of the stories you just told us, could you describe any more memorable stories of events in England during the war?
No, I think that covers it. We were all very happy, of course, when the war ended, and then we started to think about going back to the States to be trained as B-29 crewmen to go to the Pacific, which, you know, that's the way the war is. And as we went we got a 30-day furlough, and then we reported to Sioux Falls, South Dakota for reassignment. And while we were there, of course, they dropped the 2 atomic bombs and the war was ended, and we were dispersed all over the United States. I went to Marchfield, California, and had some little job. I was part of another group. We safety wired a part on a B29 engine, you know. It was just a make work type thing. And then the point system came along, and I argued a little bit, and they agreed that I had enough points to get out, so I got out in December. And I remember walking, I had my barracks bag and headed down towards the train station, and I walked past, I think it was a restaurant, and they were playing "I'll Be Home for Christmas," and sure enough I was.
Do you recall where you were when, exactly where you were when the war ended?
Do you mean when the bombs were dropped?
Yes. Or both, if you recall.
Of course, when the bombs were dropped, I was in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, waiting for reassignment, and that's when the war ended. But the surrender documents weren't signed until September, I believe. So.
How about VE Day?
Well, an interesting sidelight to that, the war ended, I think, on May 8th. And May 9th, we were allowed to make a tourist flight, I guess you would say. We flew to Germany and some of the bombed out cities at maybe 1,000 feet. We flew down the Rhine River, and I could look out my waist window and I didn't see any sky. I just saw the bank of the Rhine River. We were that low. But it was so interesting. I just wish I'd had a video camera or two, could take in some pictures, because there's so much you're seeing that you can't assimilate it all. But it was wonderful. We saw planes that had been forced landing. We saw where there had been tracks of big tank fights, trenches, and the devastation of the German cities were terrible, just terrible.
Did you work or go back to school after the war?
I came back and started immediately to go to school, and everybody had to have a part-time job doing something. I did that, went to school 3 days a week, and then I got married somewhere along the line, and got my degree, and I'm trying to think of the year. It was probably 1950.
Did you receive the benefits from the GI Bill to go back to school?
Yes, and that was a great benefit, and I think also for our country, because it raised the educational level of the average man, woman in the street several notches over it would have been. I was the first part of my family to go to college and graduate. My dad went to the 9th grade. My mother finished high school and was a rural teacher for one semester, I think. So I think that was one of the great things that happened, was the GI Bill.
Did your participation in the war contribute to your making this decision beyond the GI Bill? Did it motivate you to want to go back to school in any way?
Oh yes. Because in high school I had been a very poor student, and I wanted an opportunity to do better. And I realized that I needed it to go on and do all these grandiose things that 21-year-old people have.
What did you go on to do as a career after the war?
Well, with a degree in psychology, which was a waste of time, I went into the property casualty insurance business and stayed in it all my adult life.
Did your military experience influence your thinking about war or about the military in general?
Well, it would have to, if you were, had any sensibilities at all. It gave me an appreciation for the people who are in the military, even today, particularly today. And nothing was more saddening to me than what the Vietnam boys went through. American people should be ashamed of themselves for what they did to those veterans.
What are the experiences, do you need a second? What are the experiences that stand out after all this time that you're most proud of? Take your time.
My perseverance to get into the Army, the Air Force. If you want something badly enough and make a commitment, it can happen. Although I didn't go on and to be a pilot that I wanted to be, I didn't. The next best thing is being a crew member, so I made my donation, my participation. And I think that to me is personally what I'm proud of, and that I did my job as best I could.
Is there anything you'd like to add that we have not covered in this interview?
No, I think we've covered quite a lot. It's just that it's the most significant part of my life. And I'm proud for what I did. I'm not bragging about it, but I'm proud that I was up to do what I had to do.
We'll conclude this interview, Alan. I'd just like to state, before we kill the camera, that Ryan and I would like to thank you for taking the time for the interview, and we appreciate everything you've done in this country. And because you're actually in World War II, we enjoy the freedoms from the fruits of your labor. Thank you very much, sir.
You're certainly welcome.
Sir.
I think my age realized that, and that how times have changed so much, and that our great country is not being, its virtues are not being taught, explained, expounded. And it just saddens me to think how this country is being destroyed from within, weakened.
You know, what amazes me is I can only pretend to know what life was like in 1943 because I wasn't there. But I know it was a lot different from what I've read and from what I've heard. I think about you being a young man back in 1943 and being thrust into this great conflict and going through and all the things you went through and everything you experienced. One thing that I'm always shocked at is how were you guys able to settle back into civilian life after experiencing all that? I mean, you were flying in B24s across Europe, in part of the strategic Air Force. How it always amazed me that how could you come back and settle in after participating in something like that? Was it difficult for you, or did you just take right to it?
I never even thought about it. It just did it. And I think growing up in the 40s was probably the greatest experience that anybody could have. Life in the 40s in a small town. Oh, I'm so thankful for that. We had one high school, little town friendships, and the friendships that keep today. We're having our 60th high school, if you can believe that, 60th high school reunion. I can't believe I'm that old until I look in the mirror every morning. I realize that. But it's, and those, I didn't go, I'm not much on conventions, reunions and all that. So the first, we never had a high school reunion until 1993, which would be 50 years. So I agonized over that about going. I went, and do you know that some of the people that, like friends of mine in school, because we had a small, there was about 100 in our graduating class, I guess. After 15, 20 minutes, it was like I'd never been away. And one of the fellows come up, he said, you know, watching you and Hank talk over there, it's like you'd never been away. And I hadn't seen him for 50 years. But those values, and that's, you know, multiplied around the United States, I'm sure. But the things we did and the fun. In fact, I'm going to, in the last week of March, I've got a condo in that we've rented in Hilton Head, South Carolina, and 3 of those people are going to, 3 couples are going to be there.
That's great.
One was in the Army, one was in the Navy, a younger fellow, and the other one is my cousin. He wasn't in anything, but he was in the service, but he did not in the combat or anything. So it's just a great time, the 40s. In fact, I've been asked to work up a program for the museum, Fort Bend County Museum, on life in the 40s. And I've been a little hesitant to do all this. I've got the research done, now I just have to write it. But one of the things that we did participate as a member of the Confederate Air Force, Texas Southern University here had an aviation program for 4 years, I believe, and we were asked to provide speakers, and I spoke on the development of air power from World War I through World War II. And that was interesting. I had to do some research on that myself, and as usual the case, the speaker learns more than the students do from listening to you. But I did that until the program was, they lost their funding for it, and but that was good. And some of those young people could care less, and 1 or 2 of them I think were really interested, which is about average. So I have tried to teach my son about the importance of being responsible for your own behavior and your decision. You make a bad decision, you work like hell to correct it or learn from it. And his son, I've got videos of the war and books. And I said, you know, when Corey gets to the age of being a junior in high school, I want you to play these things and talk it over with him. So because he's not going to get it in the school books. He'll think World War II might be a paragraph like it is now.
That's true.
It's interesting you mentioned that. One of the primary motivating factors for me to get involved in and try to record and archive living history, was the birth of my 2 sons, and hoping that at least one of them will appreciate history and the lessons we must learn from it as much as I do. And I was thinking the same thing that you were thinking. It's like, what could I show him? What resources could I direct him towards? And I'm hoping that someday, if he really wants to learn the real deal, as they say, he can access information like this at the Library of Congress and get a more meaningful picture of the real people who participated in World War II and other foreign wars.
But don't overlook the fact that there are some good videos that he can look at and some good books that will direct the thinking. Gosh, I must have 200 books out there. And I told my son, if you ever place any of those in the garage sale for 25 or 50 cents, I'm going to come back and slap the hell out of you.
You're going to haunt him.